I would like to invite our first presenter, Felix Pot, from Groningen University. He is a researcher. He's been researching on this subject of accessibility and rural accessibility and the role of data in terms of assessing rural accessibility in his PhD as well. So he will share with us today all his findings in 15 minutes. So it will be a short intervention from him, as much as he can squeeze into there. I'm sure the research is much broader on this, but we are really interested and excited to hear what your findings are, Felix. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Edina. Well, not all my findings probably, but I hope to squeeze in as much as possible. So thank you very much for having me. I'll try sharing my screen. We tested this and it worked. So there we go. There we go. So yeah, thank you very much. Again, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and I work in the geography department. More specifically, I work on transport geography, and last year I earned my PhD on accessibility in rural areas. And what I did in my PhD was comparing how we measure accessibility with how people perceive accessibility and how people eventually evaluate accessibility. But more on that later. When we think of accessibility in rural areas, we usually might think of pictures like this. This is a supermarket in a village in the northern part of the Netherlands, but there's no shopping going on anymore. It has closed down, just like the local butcher, post office, local bank. All these facilities have diminished in this rural village in the north of Groningen. On the other hand, we have thriving cities with lots of opportunities, lots of shops, lots of people enjoying themselves, lots of diversity in facilities, and all at short distance. And recently, there is a growing interest in this urban-rural divide, at least in the Netherlands, but also Europe-wide, I would say. And the main cause is that there is a spatial concentration and upscaling of activities going on. So local village supermarkets close down as people are now mobile enough to visit a larger supermarket further away, where they have more diversity, more offer, where there are more products offered, usually at lower prices. So we see this upscaling and spatial concentration of shops, of economic activity, of jobs, of all these facilities, and also population. Many rural areas are, of course, faced with population decline. And this has made people say that accessibility actually has become the challenge for rural areas. As distances increase, how can we ensure that all people still have access to the destinations they need? And actually, it's quite difficult to judge this gap between urban and rural areas. When do distances actually become too large? When are the benefits of efficiency outweighed by the disbenefits from social exclusion, for example? It's quite hard to tell based on data on travel times, on distances, on accessibility, which maybe combine data on travel time and distances, because they might not tell everything about how these distances actually impact people. So this brought me to the question, how do these spatial measures of accessibility, or how does spatial data in general relate to experience levels of accessibility? And that's what my PhD was about. And we did an empirical analysis of this in the Netherlands, but I'll show you the main results of that later. So first, what is accessibility again? If you look at definitions in the literature, one that pops up, it's a classical one, it's the potential of opportunities for interaction. So very broad, all the potential there is to interact with opportunities that are spatially dispersed. A more recent definition, which is used quite often nowadays, is the extent to which land use and transport system enables individuals to reach activities or destinations by means of a combination of transport modes. And other definitions highlight that it is about the freedom of individuals, or even more broadly and more as a utility-based definition, it is all the benefits that the transport and land use system provides. But what comes to the fore out of these definitions is that accessibility is actually more than just the transport system and land use. It's actually the potential of people to make use and to benefit from the transport and land use system. So if we map this schematically, we have spatial resources, so what's around us, destinations, supermarkets, shops, banks, jobs, whatever. Those locations are dispersed across space. There is a transport system. There might be roads, there might be buses driving on these roads. These buses are expensive or not expensive. There might be trains. But before this actually turns into the potential of reaching activities, people need to be able to make use of this land use and transport system. And this ability or this potential to actually make use of the land use and transport system depends on your age, your income, whether you have a car or not, and also based on your preferences. Are the jobs around me, are they suitable for me? Do they fit my education, for example? So between the spatial measures or the spatial factors that entail accessibility that we can measure, the land use system and the transport system, and the actual potential to reach those activities and to benefit from those activities, is always individual factors. Individual factors determine whether people actually can make use of the land use and transport system, and also therefore the extent to which people benefit from it. Well, when we measure accessibility, we can, for example, make a map like this. This is a map that shows the area of supermarkets within 2 kilometers and 5 kilometers in a part of the province of Friesland in the Netherlands. And we get a clear overview of where supermarkets are reachable within 2 kilometers or 5 kilometers. We can also just look at people's activity spaces, for example. There we can exactly see what people access. But we can also ask for the experience of people, and then we get a much richer image. This map is a drawing of accessibility, basically, but it shows in much more detail what's important for an individual, how distances are perceived, which locations are perceived as available, which places are known, which transport modes are available. So from this little exercise of looking at a measure of the number of supermarkets within 2 kilometers and an individual perception of accessibility, we can expect that there might be mismatches between calculated measures of accessibility and how people actually experience accessibility. And unfortunately, ultimately, it is impossible to fully capture an individual's possibility to access desired activities. Each individual has different needs, different desires, and also different abilities. Some might have a car, some don't. Some might be able to walk 10 kilometers, some are not able to walk at all. So there's a lot of heterogeneity within populations. Furthermore, there is heterogeneity in activity locations. When we map the number of supermarkets, what do we count as a supermarket? Do we also account for bakeries or other shops? And do we also disaggregate for regular supermarkets, very large supermarkets, very small supermarkets? So there's also heterogeneity in the types of activities. And all this heterogeneity might not be easily or directly observable, particularly when we think about preferences of people, income sensitivity or price sensitivity of people, for example, or the willingness to travel long distances. So we're faced here with a challenge that on the one hand, we want to measure accessibility, want to map accessibility, we want to get a grip on what people can access. But on the other hand, we're not able to fully capture it at an individual level. So we need to aggregate basically our measures of accessibility. We need to decide on which individual characteristics are most important to incorporate in our accessibility metrics. And there are two main ways of doing this. So how to bridge this gap between a calculated indicator and how accessibility is experienced. One way is the most common way is top-down. We just try to incorporate individual characteristics into a spatial indicator, which means that we beforehand aggregate based on assumptions on perceived accessibility. So thinking back of a map that mapped supermarket accessibility, for example, the number of supermarkets within 2 kilometers, we basically assume that 2 kilometers is a feasible threshold for the population that the measure aims to cover. Although we know that for some people it's not, and for others 2 kilometers is perfectly fine. So this is a priori or beforehand aggregation based on assumptions. So a top-down perspective. We have a measure and then we make assumptions. The other way is to try this to do bottom-up. We can try to measure perceived accessibility and then aggregate a spatial indicator based on how different groups perceive accessibility in the same location. So for example, if we have a location in which a supermarket is 2 kilometers away, and half of the population has a car and experiences this as very high accessibility, and the other half of the population without a car is unsatisfied with accessibility, we might want to aggregate this measure based on car ownership. So there we, based on perceptions, you can disaggregate a spatial indicator to find the balance between capturing as much heterogeneity as possible, but also keep the analysis doable and tractable. This is exactly what I've done during my PhD. And these two maps together basically tell the whole story of my PhD. So I could tell all my findings within 5 minutes, maybe even. On the left-hand side, there are our survey respondents. So we did a large-scale survey on perceived accessibility in the Netherlands. And on the left-hand side, we have for each respondent calculated the number of facilities within 5 kilometers. And for those who are familiar with the topography of the Netherlands, you can clearly see a core periphery pattern where in the large cities such as Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, accessibility is very high, whereas at the edges of the country, for example, in the north, in Groningen, accessibility is rather low. These are where the rural areas are. So that's the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side, for the same survey respondents, we mapped their satisfaction with accessibility or their perceived accessibility. And we used a perceived accessibility index. It's a psychological, it's a scale based on psychological research, which basically measures how satisfied people are or how well they are able to reach their activities that they want to. And there we don't see this core periphery pattern. It's actually much more even. We have about as many satisfied people in rural areas as in urban areas, or the percentage of people that are not satisfied with accessibility in rural areas is not that much higher than you would expect based on differences in the number of facilities. Overall, 10% of the population perceived accessibility to be low. In urban and intermediate areas, this is around 8%, and in rural, it's 12%. So a bit more in rural areas, but there is little variation in the perceived accessibility levels compared to the differences in number of facilities. And this, well, made us, of course, wonder, what are the mechanisms? Why are people in rural areas on average just as satisfied as people in urban centers? And we found two mechanisms to this. First, there are diminishing returns to the number of facilities. On the left-hand side, you see the city of Groningen, where I live, and I've mapped the number of supermarkets just based on Google Maps. And there are, well, about 10 supermarkets within 500 meters walking distance from my home. On the right-hand side, there is a village in Groningen, quite close to where I was born, and there is only one supermarket within a distance of 15 kilometers almost. So one supermarket versus 10 supermarkets. However, it's not the case that people in the city of Groningen eat 10 times as much or are 10 times more satisfied with supermarket accessibility. If two supermarkets would close down in my city, I would be just as satisfied. So there are diminishing returns to the number of opportunities. At some point, there is this tipping point where there are enough facilities, and even more facilities will not make you much happier. And this tipping point where there is enough accessibility, or where people experience that there is enough accessibility, also lies a bit lower in rural areas. So we found effects of residential sorting, meaning that people in rural areas prioritize more often a quiet living environment, a green living environment, compared to lots of heterogeneity in facilities. Zooming in on Dutch rural areas, as I said, overall high levels of perceived accessibility, and this is mainly because people experience that there still is enough accessibility. However, the mechanisms why people still think there is enough are strongly based on car ownership. So people without a car more often perceived accessibility to be low. This level of sufficiency strongly hinges on car ownership. And this was also one of the most important factors that bridge the difference between how accessibility is perceived versus how it is measured. So we found quite low accessibility levels in rural areas based on our measurements, so based on distances compared to urban areas. However, thanks to the car, thanks to relatively high incomes in some cases, people still experience accessibility as good, which means that this was an important factor in our analysis to aggregate the calculated based measure on. And our findings reveal, I think, a new type of rural challenge. In the discussions around the rural-urban gap, it often is about closing this gap, bringing back facilities to rural areas, bringing back bus lines to rural areas. However, the upscaling of activities and the spatial concentration of activities has actually increased accessibility for most people in rural areas. Thanks to the car and thanks to upscaling of, for example, supermarkets, they have more access to high-end facilities compared to only being able to reach the local supermarket. However, it has also made rural areas car dependent, which means that accessibility increasingly conflicts with goals around social inclusion and sustainability. So the main challenge is not to close the urban-rural gap that would basically force rural areas back in time, but maintaining accessibility to these high-quality facilities more sustainably and also more inclusively. And therefore, we need to find a balance between the efficiency of mobility and upscaling, the efficiency of car mobility in particular, with social inclusion and sustainability, as car mobility also excludes people and is not always a sustainable alternative. To conclude and to summarize, I think there is no objective accessibility in contrast to perceived accessibility. There are, of course, objective distances, and there are, of course, objective travel times, but these do not equal accessibility, as these travel times and these distances mean different things for people with different preferences and abilities. Therefore, calculated accessibility measures based on travel times and based on distances are just proxies for how people actually experience accessibility. And this does not complicate matters. I think we should use these simple indicators, but strongly interpret them or explicitly interpret them by referring to how the population actually might experience accessibility. So when we have a map of supermarket accessibility within 5 kilometers, we should critically ask ourselves, what does this mean for the population? And I think that aggregation based on some simple indicators, such as car ownership, such as income, such as abilities, could be a way to better construct these simple measures and make them a rich source of information. Thank you very much.